Hello and welcome back. So this week we are going to look at convolutional neural networks, or otherwise CNNs as they are referred to as. These are the kind of networks that are specially used for analyzing grid-like data, specifically images, and so they have wide applicability in medical image analysis. And many of the state-of-the-art results that you see in especially image segmentation arise from CNN algorithms. Okay, so there are CNN architectures. We'll see what that means. Developed specifically for image analysis, which do very well for all kinds of images, from radiology to histopathology. Okay, so we are going to briefly look at what CNNs, what kind of algorithms CNNs are, and how to use them in the context of medical image analysis. Okay, so here's the organization for this week's lectures. So we're going to look at introduction, which is basically the motivation for having a convolutional neural network, especially in the context of image data. We'll look at what are the operations that go into a convolutional neural network. So we have looked at feed-forward neural networks, and we know the operations involved there. Here there are some slight differences. We'll look at what they are and the consequences of these operations. And we will also take a brief look at some training tips, the important factors to keep track of when you're training a neural network. And we will look at some architectures, the ones that are often used when designing CNN architectures for medical image analysis. So these are architectures which were mostly developed for the image recognition, and these are of course adapted for other variety of other tasks, even like segmentation. And so we look at these architectures and some of the salient features of these architectures, just to get an understanding of how they work. So from fully connected to convolutions. Okay, so what do they mean? What does it mean? So if we consider a artificial neural network, what it does, or ANN as it's called, we also refer to it as feed-forward neural network. Right? You must have seen this feed-forward neural network. This is what we refer to as. It takes a vector of inputs. Now, these inputs, this vector of inputs, as we call them, we sometimes refer to them as neurons in the intermediate layers. Right? Each element of this vector we refer to as a neuron or a unit, and these are used interchangeably throughout this lecture. So, an artificial neural network, which is basically a feed-forward neural network, takes a vector of inputs and produces as output another hidden layer vector fully connected to the input. So what does that mean? It means that, so if, for instance, if you have, I'll just draw something very simple. Let's say 3 inputs, okay? We call them x1, x2, x3. And then let's say you have 3 outputs, the output layer, right? We call them h1, h2, and h3, okay? Each of them is a hidden unit, and this is a hidden layer, right? This whole thing is a hidden layer. This is a hidden layer. Okay. So now, so we know that when we say fully connected, we mean that, if you take the H1, it's connected to all of its inputs in the previous layer. Take H2, it's connected to all of its inputs in the previous layer. If you take H3, once again, it's connected to all of its inputs in the previous layer. So, which means that, so if you have N1 inputs and N2 in the outputs, you need a N1 cross N2 matrix of weights. So with N1, N2 being the total number of elements. Okay. So, now let's consider, let's say, an input which is actually an image. Okay. For instance, let's say RGB images. These are images that you find on the internet, that you take with your cell phones, etc. These have the size 224 cross 224 cross 3. Okay. So if you just say, in fact, this is basically of the order of 10 raised to 4 features, right? So if you consider each pixel as a feature, that's about 10 raised to 4 features, right? Okay, 10 raised to 4 to 10 raised to 5 features, depending. So now, if you look at this, then we need to connect. If you try to analyze these images, let's say the task of image recognition using a fully connected feed-forward neural network. Okay. If you take, let's say, one neuron, which is, I'm just going to draw this here. If you take this one neuron, let's say there are this 10 raised to 4 neurons here. If you say one neuron in the output layer, it has so many weights coming. It has 10 raised to 5 weights coming into it alone. So if you think about it, then you see that the weight matrix, which maps this input to the output layer, no matter how many neurons you make it to be, it's going to be a very large weight matrix. Okay? So it means there's an explosion in the number of weights. It typically means that we end up requiring more memory and computations. And of course, since there are more weights, we need more data to estimate. Right? So this is again a very nominal example. Right? You can see just for one neuron, how do we, if you rasterize this picture, let's say we take an image, right? Image is, you see it as a grid, and then you rasterize it, like you flatten it like a vector, right? And flatten this out like a vector. Now we can have a fully connected neural network which takes this as a feature input, right? Entire image is like a vector of features with every pixel corresponding to a feature. And now if you even to produce one output neuron, you need as many connections as these. It's about 10 raised to 5 weights. So imagine if you have a hidden layer which have like thousands of neurons. So you see the number of weights just explodes. So that's the issue with using a fully connected neural network to analyze data which has grid-like structure. Right? So this is in the form of a grid. Okay? So you can lay out the image pixels in the form of a grid primarily because there is correlation between nearby pixels. Right? So if you take an image, this pixel definitely has correlation with all the surrounding pixels. So it's meaningful to put them in the form of a grid. So the proximity has meaning. So a lot of such data exists where you can put them in a grid and where it has meaning. So let's look at how typical output is calculated in a convolutional neural network, and this process is what is known as convolution. That's where the name comes from. So we will look at 2D inputs, right? So we have this image, this grid-like input, and the values of at each of the grid points is basically A, B, C, D, E, F as shown by this represented by A, B, C, D, etc. These are numerical values. Of course, if you take a picture or an image, then each of these are nothing but the pixel values, right? So we saw that for a CT image, pixel values will go from the voxel values will go from -1000 to 3095. If you have a grayscale image, they'll go from 0 to 255. So those will be the values taken up by A, B, C, D, etc. This filter kernel is basically, these are the weights of your network. Okay, and it's actually in the form of very small matrix, and these are of the order of 2 cross 2, 3 cross 3, or 5 cross 5 matrices. And we'll see why it's arranged that way. And we can, of course, we'll also see how we can represent this in the form of a typical feed-forward neural network also. Okay, so in the case of a convolutional neural network, here's how the output is calculated. So you would superimpose this filter kernel as it's called, on top of the image at various locations, and in fact you would do this in a systematic way by sliding this across the image, and at every position, at 1 pixel at a time or 2 pixels at a time in horizontal and vertical directions, you would slide this kernel across the image, and at every position you would multiply with the corresponding elements of the input, add them to get the output. So for instance, if you take this particular output unit, a neuron, its value is basically A times B, not A times B, A times W plus B times X plus E times Y, like I did, and F times Z. So you're going to superimpose this kernel on top of the input, multiply the corresponding elements and add them up to get a particular output. And you do that by sliding this kernel across the input. So we'll look at a slightly more detailed numerical examples in later slides. Just to give you an idea of how this works. Okay. Of course, we can also represent this in the form of a feed-forward neural network. We'll see that also in the subsequent slides. Okay. So from fully connected to convolutional. So I just want to show you in this graphic, how we can understand this. So if you are thinking of grid-like inputs, okay, and this is a grid, it's a 5 cross 5 grid of input. You can call this a small image. And we want to, let's say, calculate. So this smaller box here is your output. Okay, this is one of the hidden layers, if you can call it. This entire matrix is one hidden layer. Okay, and if you do the fully connected way, then what you would have is a weight arising from every one of these pixels or grid points to the output, and of course they are connected to the output through weights W. Okay, so every output unit here in this grid is connected to all the elements in the input grid. Okay, and through weights. So there are as many weights as there are elements in the grid. Now, when you come to convolutional neural networks, what we try to do is the sparse connection. We'll see that because this is the output. Here, this output unit is connected to only a subset of the input. So in this case, it's connected to a 3 cross 3 set of the input. So you can see where the kernel comes from. So last time we saw 2 cross 2 kernel. So which means that this is being operated upon by a 3 cross 3 kernel to produce this output. Okay. So how do we visualize this in the context of, in a feed-forward network configuration? So let's say this is the input layer right here, and this is the output layer. Okay. So in a feed-forward neural network configuration, what you will have for every output is connected to all its inputs, all the units in the input layer. Okay, so we'll just show you for one more. So that's typical configuration. Okay, that you would see this, and once again, the red and blue indicate a unique set of weights. Okay, of course, there are, in a sense, every red is different, slightly different, but this is one set of weights which only connects to this neuron, to our output unit, right? So in the case of a convolutional neural network, you would represent this way. So for instance, this output is only connected to these three, and maybe this output would be connected to these three inputs, and so on and so forth, right? So this is not, again, this is not for 2D, this is in 1D, but still you can, if you rasterize this input and lay it out in a proper fashion, we can still illustrate it in this fashion. But just for the sake of understanding, you understand now for this output, you are only connected to these three, okay? Once again, I'm assigning a unique set of weights to each one of these outputs, and we will see that that's necessarily not the case, and that's where this concept called parameter sharing comes in. So this is sparse connection because now see that this output is only produced by three inputs. So if you write down the weight matrix, so if you write down the weight matrix itself, right, it's a good exercise. Write down a weight matrix for this configuration, and you will see that there will be a lot of zeros in it. Okay, that's the way to understand it. That's why it's a sparse connection, right? And of course, there is parameter sharing because these sets of black weights and blue weights need not be different. Okay, so we'll see more about that in the later stage. So this is the general understanding of how we analyze grid data, just that we do not connect all the inputs to one output unit. When you're analyzing grid data, we're just looking at subsets of it, and they're connected using weights, a bunch of weights which we refer to as filter kernels. Okay, so I will talk more about this sparse connectivity, right? The sparse connectivity due to a small convolutional kernel. We will look at what a convolutional kernel is again in more detail, but for this purpose, we'll just see this. But this is just a bunch of weights that take a set of inputs to the output unit. Okay, so from the point of view of the input, you see that even as I had drawn in the previous slide, you see this X3 in the input layer. So this is the input layer. Okay, and this is the output layer. Okay, and they have these units in the input and in the input and the output. So if you see from the input layer point of view, this particular input feature or our unit is only connected to a very small subset of the output units. Okay, and that happens because of the way we do these connections, as you saw in the previous slide. But if you look at the typical feed-forward neural network, we'll see that every unit in the input is connected to all the units in the output. That's typical in the case of a feed-forward configuration. This is called, so this is densely connected as it's referred to here, and these are sparsely connected. Okay. The other way to look at it is from an input an output point of view. So if you take one output neuron here, it's only connected to a subset of the inputs, which is through the weights. Of course, when I say connected, I mean the output is a linear combination of a subset of the inputs. In this case, just 3 of them, right? So, but if you consider, let's say, a feed-forward neural network fully connected, you will see that that all of the input is connected to each one of the outputs. So S3 is, for instance, gets its inputs from all of these 5. Okay, if there are only 5 neurons, 5 units in the input. Okay. So this we again saw a few slides ago where I drew some of these pictures. So this connectivity, like I said, if you write the weight matrix for this connection, for this layer, from mapping X layer to the S layer, you will see that weight matrix has a lot of zeros in it. Okay, so that's the understanding of that's how you understand a sparse connectivity. And we'll also see one more concept that we'll keep running into often is this receptive field. So since we are only connecting the output neuron or output unit to a very small subset of the input. So if you, for instance, if you see, let's consider this H3, for instance, right? H3 is connected to X2, X3, and X4, right? So these 3. So this is the let me use this is the receptive field. Okay, this is the receptive field. Now for H3, this is the receptive field. Now if you consider a fully connected network, then for every output unit, the entire X1 to X5 is the receptive field. But now let's now go one more layer deep, and we do the same kind of connections. You'll see that, for instance, G3's receptive field, if you call it that, is just again these 3, right? So now, but if you consider, if you look at H2, H3, and H4, see, for instance, H2 actually does look at X1 to X3, gets its inputs from X1 to X3, and H4 gets inputs from X3 to X5. So technically, G3's receptive field is this entire input. Right? It looks at all of this. Okay. This is very useful concept to know from the point of view of image analysis. Okay. So this is a 1D example, so it might not be so clear, but so if all the way to understand it is that if you have a convolutional neural network working on an input image, and as you go deeper into the network, every output unit in any one of the layers, let's say if you go to 5-10 layers, then is actually getting its input from a very large piece of the image, okay, a section of the image. So that's a good point to know. Okay. The parameter sharing is something I mentioned in passing once again to understand this, right? So the usual, if you look at the traditional feed-forward neural network, we saw that, if you take S1, for instance, S1 gets its input from X1 to X5. So basically, you have a bunch of weights. So S1 is some summation of WIXI, right? And if you look at S2, that also is based on some, instead of WIs, I'll just maybe, if I use a subscript here, WI S1, and S2 is also a linear combination WI S2 XI. Okay. Again, I have not shown the nonlinearity, so you would actually have a pointwise nonlinearity, some G, which I am not mentioning, but just to understand where the inputs come from. So every one of these output units is linear combination followed by nonlinearity of its input units. And the linear combination is affected by these weight vectors. Once again, you can put them into a matrix form also, where each of these weight vectors are unique, right? These WI S1s and WI S2s are a different set of weights. Now, for the convolutional neural networks, okay, they share the same parameters across all spatial locations, which means, so for instance, if you take S2, let's say, then its inputs are from X1, X2, and X3, right? So S1 is some W1 X1 plus W2 X2 plus W3 X3. So we just write this down here quickly. S1, S2 is W1 X1 plus W2 X2 plus W3 X3. Okay. Now if you go to S3, we can actually write, just 1 second. Let's say S3, right? Now S3 in this case can be written as this. We can use the same combination, right? We can say, W1 X2 plus W2 X3 plus W3 X4. Okay. So it's the same set of weights. You just translate along this vector to multiply and produce this. Okay, once again, I'm ignoring the non-linearity. Those things remain the same when you go from fully connected to convolutional neural networks. Okay, so the processing is the same. The linear combination followed by non-linearity, that process remains the same from feed-forward neural networks to convolutional neural networks. The only thing that we are doing is, as we saw earlier, is that we are doing sparse connections in the sense, we're not taking all the inputs to produce one output. We're only doing a subsection of the inputs, and then the weight vectors are shared across different subsets of inputs, right? So x1, x2, x3 is multiplied by a set of weights followed by nonlinearity to get S2. You can use the same set of weights to multiply x2, x3, x4 followed by nonlinearity to produce S3, so on and so forth. So we can use these weights again and again over different input units. So which means that for image analysis, this translates to sliding the weight matrix filter kernel that we saw across same weight matrix across the image to get an output. Okay, we'll have a more detailed illustration later, but just for understanding. So this gives you another angle. So now we have used one set of weights W1, W2, W3 to produce this outputs S1, S2, S3, S4, and S5. Okay. Of course, we are ignoring let's assume that there are some neurons here to the left of X1 and some neurons to right, which we will not consider them at this point. But we have just used one bunch of weights W1, W2, W3 to get S1, S2, S3, S4, and S5. Also possible to do another set of weights. Okay. So if you so we can call them we can use different subscript. So let's say we'll subscript this as some J. So we can have J. Here the J doesn't refer to a layer or anything. It is just one set of weights, the Jth set of weights. So we can have another sets of three weights, which can give rise to another set of activations. Okay. So there can be another set of activation. Okay. So we can have as many sets of activations or output units by choosing a different set of weights of 3. So we can just keep doing this. Okay. So one thing that you have to do in a convolutional neural network is to determine how many such sets of weights or filter kernels that you want to define. But that's a hyperparameter, so called, for a convolutional neural network. So, but once again, notwithstanding parameter sharing, I can have multiple such sets of weights. So you can say, okay, how does this help? You can see that to produce this. So if you think about this, if you are using fully connected neural network, then this is 5 cross 5. You need 25 weights to produce one set of outputs, right? But in this case, we just needed 3 weights to get an entire new output layer, hidden layer, with 5 hidden units, correct? And then in fact, if you do 5-6 sets of such weights, right, you can get multiple sets of hidden units. Okay, so that's the idea behind parameter sharing, and that's also how you define multiple layers in one layer. Like so every layer in a convolutional neural network will have multiple sets of such activations, and That's what you would call a layer in a convolutional neural network. Okay. All right. So just to summarize, intermediate summary, for a feed-forward neural network, you have full connections where every output element is connected to all the input elements. For a CNN, only a subset of inputs is connected to an output, so that's why you get sparse connections. Another way of looking at it is that your weight matrix, there will be lots of zeros. The same set of weights connect multiple outputs to different inputs, right? So you can just basically think of it as sliding that weight vector across the input vector to get different outputs. Okay. These weights are typically visualized as filter kernels. If you're looking at 2D or multiple dimensional inputs, so the illustrations so far have all been on a vector of inputs. But if you can think of a 2D input, then these weights can also be looked at like a small matrix or a filter kernel that you slide over the image and to get a particular output activation map or hidden units. One aspect of CNN which we'll look at later is that CNNs enable this so-called hierarchical learning, wherein you learn features which, when composed, give rise to a different set of higher order features. Okay, we'll look at that later. But this is just something that comes from the architecture itself. That is basically because your outputs are compositions of functions. Then this gives rise to the hierarchical learning. Okay, so if you want to understand what these filter kernels do, again we'll have much more detailed example next. But just in the context of an actual input, let's say that our input is this dog image. Okay, this is our input vector, and this is in the first layer we are defining this weights. Once again, you would randomly initialize your weights just like you would do for linear regression as well as for the feed-forward neural network. And in this case, you just fix the weights to be 1 minus 1. And if you actually superimpose the weights 1 minus 1, multiply with the underlying pixel values, add the products, so you will get one output there. If you do that, what this does is to highlight the edges of the image. So you get this edge map. Now this is your output. This is one output layer. Okay. Now what I said was, now you can do multiple sets of such filters. Okay. So you can have multiple such filter kernels, and each one of them will produce a similar output. Okay. You stack them all up to get this output layer in a convolutional neural network. The other reason why this example is illuminating is because you see that these filter kernels, in this case, you can actually learn this. You can actually learn these edge detectors. So this n minus 1 turns out to be edge detector. So similarly, when you train a neural network, especially the any earlier layers, you will get these primitive image processing operations done automatically. Edge detectors, quantum detectors, blob detectors, etc. Okay. The compositions of these in the further layers will end up detecting, entire, in this case, ears, eyes, nose, etc. So that's why we also refer to as hierarchical learning. Okay, so we will just illustrate convolution. Okay, so we're going to look at a 2D input. Okay, a very small picture of size 5 cross 5. Even a larger picture, let's say 256 cross 256, 224 cross 224, is the same operation. Our filter weight, in this case I'll call this weight vector, but here it's actually a weight matrix. I shouldn't call this weight matrix, but it's a small filter, or as they say, a filter kernel. Okay. So what it does is it acts on the input and gives you a particular output. So this operation, which I'm going to describe, is referred to as a convolution, but not to be confused with the convolution which is in signal processing literature. There, the process is slightly different. Okay, so let's not worry about how it's done there, but rather in this context, let's see what convolution means as we go step by step. So what you would do is you will superimpose this kernel on top of the image. Okay, and we zoom in, maybe it helps. Okay, you will superimpose this kernel on this image, and you would multiply corresponding elements So it's 1 times 1. Just to write this down, it's 1 times 1 plus 0 times 1 plus 2 times 0. That's the first row. Again, second row of computation, so on and so forth. Third row plus 7 times 1. This is the third row of computation. Plus 0 times 0 plus 1 times 2. That will give you 13. Okay. So this is the computation. This is what is the convolution, that way to understand convolution, that as it happens in a CNN. Okay. So this is your filter kernel, or these sets of weights in a feed-forward neural network. These would be called weights. Okay, here you just call them as filter kernel. All right. So you would do this operation by sliding this filter kernel over the input. In this case, our input is small; it's 5 cross 5. But you typically get much larger input, 256 cross 256. Or 128 cross 128, and you can resize them, and if you find that it takes too much memory. So for this particular input, you are superimposing the kernel on top of the image, starting from the top left kernel, and multiplying the corresponding underlying elements, adding them to get one output here. Okay. Once again, these are just the weights that you estimate in a feed-forward neural network. And we can define multiple such kernels. When I say define, you initialize multiple such kernels. You realize that these are what are learned, because the weights are learned while training a neural network. Similarly, for a convolutional neural network, these filter kernels are learned. So you can have multiple such weights, matrices, or filter kernels, which operate on a convolution to produce multiple such output feature maps, as they are called. Okay. Similarly, we'll walk through this slowly, so you can move this once again. The next, so what you have done here is translated this filter kernel 1 pixel to the right, did the same operation, and got this value. Similarly, you can do this for all positions. You can move it to the right. For rightmost, now we are at the rightmost. Now here is something that to pay attention to. So here we are not done anything special to this image. So it's not uncommon to do this zero padding. Okay. So what you would do is you would add a bunch of zeros to the boundary, okay, of the image, or some other value which is meaningful, so that you can push the kernel further. So typically the valid convolutions, as they're called, you would start from the top left, and you always have the filter kernel completely inside the image. So you start from top left. As soon as you hit the point beyond which you cannot slide the filter kernel, you stop, and then you come to the next row. Okay. So, but if you do want to keep going on, then you would have to zero pad appropriately, so that you can move the filter kernel as far as you want to. Okay. Similarly, here if you look, you have now, after hitting this rightmost pixel, you now moved it one step down. Let me see here. Yeah, moved one step down, 1 pixel down, and then you continue doing the same operation. Okay. So you can keep doing this until we get your final output. One thing you have to notice is that in this output, you will notice that that number of, so you started off with 5 cross 5. Now your output has only 3 cross 3 elements. Okay. So this convolution automatically, because you didn't pad with zeros, it automatically reduces the number. Okay. So you start off with 5 cross 5, you will lose. In this case, you lost about 2, right? 2 elements when you do the convolution. Okay. So this basically is, if you start with 5 cross 5, of course, you're looking at always at square inputs and square filter kernels. So you would basically 5 minus 3 plus 1. That's the size of your output. Okay. So the dimensions of your image minus the dimensions of your filter kernel plus 1, that will be the size of the output, if you do not zero pad. So if you want to preserve the size, you would have to add a 0 to the edges, so that and as many zeros as it's required to make sure that the input and the output are of the same size. That's a trick that people do in order to preserve the so-called resolution of the output. Now this output here you would often refer to as a feature map or an activation map. Okay, either are fine. Similarly, individual elements here, units here, you would call them neurons, okay, or activations, okay, because it's an activation map, or hidden units, okay, or which all of these are acceptable terms. But typically, you would say this is a feature map. You would call this you would call this an input feature map. This as an output feature map. Okay, these are all terms which are used interchangeably in the convolutional neural network jargon. But essentially, that's it's just basically our output layer. Okay, in a feed-forward neural network, these should be laid out like a vector, but here they are still retain the grid structure of the input. The idea here is to retain the grid structure of the input because the grid structure, like we discussed earlier, has some meaning, right? Pixels nearby possibly belong to the same object if you're talking about an image, and probably share the same properties. So that spatial location information has to be maintained, and one way to maintain that is to put them in a grid. So the intermediate layers are in the form of grids also, and you can define as many filter kernels as you want, and correspondingly as many output maps will be generated. Okay, so if another way of doing this to reduce computations in successive layers, okay, because you eventually want one output if you are doing regression, or let's say a vector of 3 or 5, 4 outputs depending on if you are using the k outputs if you are doing classification. Okay, but if you look at the way we have been computing, it will seem like it'll take forever to get to that point, right? Because you have fairly large images, 256 cross 256, and even if you, and typically you would use 3 cross 3 or 5 cross 5 kernels, because larger kernels means that you need more computations. Then at that rate at which you are doing, like you're losing about 2 size of 2 on either dimension as you do convolutions without zero padding, it will take a lot of layers of computations to get to the output, and without increasing number of computations, one way to do that is to do a so-called slided convolution. So the previous one, we were sliding the filter kernel 1 pixel at a time. Here you would slide them 2 pixels at a time, right? So you would skip a pixel, right? You would skip a pixel, and that's a stride of 1. And of course you can skip as many pixels as you want, and that will once again give a corresponding output. So let's do this that way. You will see that in this case your outputs, you can do the same. If you stride 1, you have missed out on, instead of 3 cross 3, you will end up getting a 2 cross 2 output, right? Because your left alignment was with 1. Let me show you zoomed in, right? So you have skipped this pixel. You have skipped positioning the top left corner of your filter kernel at this pixel, but rather you skipped this and moved here. So which means that in your output feature map, this particular pixel is skipped. Similarly, when you move down, you will skip this row and then superimpose from here, right? And then when you move to the right, you will once again skip one column. So if you do that, your output, and keep doing that again. I urge you to eventually do this by hand. You can compute and verify yourself. Is that you will get, this is the output. So you will get a 2 cross 2 output. Okay. So your stride also reduces the size of your output feature map. Okay. So that's one way to, of course, quickly subsample your inputs so that your computations are not huge. So that the way, and this was one way of doing that. Okay. So this is the first operation in a convolutional network, the convolutional operation that has a lot of these variations. Okay, there are different types of convolutions, right? That's one I just showed you those, and this is again taken from this particular publication. It's a very informative publication. I urge you to all to go through this. So there are 3 types that we looked at. In summary, we looked at the so-called valid convolutions, which is when you would superimpose the filter kernel on top of the feature map or the input feature map, slide it 1 pixel across a time in the horizontal and the vertical directions till you no longer can stride because you will go out of the picture. And every time you would multiply the underlying elements, take a summation, do the nonlinearity, get an output. So in this case, the light blue is the, use a different color. Light blue is the input feature map. The superimposed filter kernel is shown here. It's a 3x3. And in every location, you would again form the output. The green is the output feature map. Okay. So for a 3x3 kernel striding over a 4x4 input using unit strides. Okay. So if you read this paper, he has a very nice nomenclature developed. I'm not going to explain this here. So I'd like for you to go read it. It's not too hard to understand. Okay. Similarly, if you have padding, if you do a padding of 1, is what is shown here, pad with 1 set, you can pad with zeros or just replicate the border values. And if you would stride similarly as you did, then the output feature map, right? You see that the output size is maintained. So you had a 5x5 input. Now if you pad 1, right, which means that you pad 1 on either side. Okay, so that gives you 2 padding, and that means that your output size is maintained. Okay, but if you don't do 0 padding, but then if you do a stride, 2x2 stride, then your output ends up being 2x2. Okay, so 2x2, sorry, not a 2x2 stride of 2, which means that you actually skip a pixel. Okay, so that's what if you see, but from this image to that image. So you have initially superimposed it here, okay, did do the usual computation to get this green feature map, but then you kind of skip this column, okay. You can do that once again for this particular output feature map, you skip this row, okay. So this way you can actually subsample your feature map, right? There's one way of doing this, okay, called sided convolutions. Okay, so we look at now 2 different sets of convolutions, types of convolutions once again. So these are the dilated depth-wise and depth-wise separable convolutions. Okay, some of these images are taken from this publication, Mobile Nets, on Mobile Nets. I just zoom in just for you to see. Now, if you see this, first one is the dilated convolution. Okay, wherein so you are convolving a 3x3 filter kernel over a 7x7 input with a dilation factor of 2, which means that you're taking the filter kernel and inserting 0 rows and 0 columns. Okay, so that way, if you look at it, for the same 3x3 filter, we get a larger receptive field. That's one of the other concepts that we looked at initially, and I illustrated it with a 2D, with a 1D example. So in this case, it's with a 2D example, you can see that if you use a 3x3 kernel, you have a 3x3 neighborhood that each output is looking at a 3x3 neighborhood in the image. On the other hand, when you do this dilated convolutions, then also you are inserting these zeros in here, so that your filter kernel actually operates over a slightly larger region. Now here, what is the assumption? The assumption here is that, since these are very small 3x3, 5x5 regions, you would expect that in an image, these regions are fairly uniform. So when you introduce these zeros in the filter kernel, you're actually not missing out much. In the sense, there's no pixel to pixel strong fluctuations in the image, in the input feature map. So when you do that, then you get, for the same 3x3, you get a slightly larger receptive field. And again, here all the other rules apply. You can stride more, or you can stride less, and you can zero pad. All of these are possible. But the advantage is over several layers. If the third or the fourth layer, your output neurons or output activation maps are looking at a much larger field in the input feature maps, okay, several layers down. And this is one trick that has been used very successfully in many cases. The other types of convolution we are going to look at are the depth-wise convolutions and the depth-wise separable convolutions. These images are, once again to mention, are taken from this Mobile Nets paper. So let me just zoom in a bit just for you to see clearly. the paper as well as the pictures that were taken from them. So if you look at a standard convolution filter, d subscript k, let me just rate this, d subscript k, dk cross m. So where does this m come from? And there are n such filters. So each of them is a filter. Okay. Now you might be wondering where that comes from. So like I mentioned earlier, for every layer, you can define as many filters as you want, filter kernels as you want, and each of these filter kernels will give rise to an output feature map or output layer or output feature map, output activation map. Now you can stack them all up. So if you define m such filter kernels, then your output will have m such feature map. So in general, if you say for a convolutional neural network, your input is actually a cube. Basically you can have as many feature maps in your input side. Okay, and each of them has a certain size. So if there are m feature maps in your input, and if you actually define your filter kernel to be d subscript k cross dk, which means that its actual size is dk cross m. So the filter itself actually extends across the length, across the channel dimension. So if you stack up the feature maps, the dimensions along which you stack them up is called the channel dimension, right? So as the number of feature maps increase, that means that you have more and more channels. So to give you an example, RGB image has 3 channels. Okay, so on an input RGB image, so for instance, RGB image, there are 3 channels, which means when you say you have a 3 cross 3 filter, you actually mean that you have a 3 cross 3 cross 3 filter for an RGB image. So let's say you define m such filters, you have m such filters, then you will have m feature maps on your output. Okay, and which means that in the subsequent layer, when you are actually operating on those feature maps, your filter would be, let's say if your dk is 3, then your actual filter size is 3 cross m. So this is your filter size. So that's what happens in a standard convolutional neural network, is that your filter has a depth which is equal to the number of channels in your input. Okay, so for instance, like I said, RGB image as input, your filter actually has a channel dimension of 3. So when you say 3 cross 3 filter, it means 3 cross 3 cross 3 filter. Similarly, here in this case, m channels, your filter has size 3 cross m, and so that means that the number of computations actually increase, right? If you think about it, let's say you had defined 128 filters in your previous layer. Then you have the current layer as input, you have 128 feature maps. So you have your filter size is actually 3 cross 128. So if you do 256 such filters, that's a lot of computation. Okay, so to decrease the computation, to make computation more efficient, of course this paper shows that why they're efficient, you would actually do this so-called depth-wise convolutions, because you operate on each one of these activation maps like shown here in the pictures by using just a simple 3 cross 3. So you will define m 3 cross 3 filters. Okay, and you would just operate them across. So for each one channel, each one of the input channels, you will have one filter, right? And your output, so if you have m filters, you will have m channels as output. That's what is shown here. Okay, so this is one form of reducing your computational burden. So you will have m outputs. Okay, so and if you want to combine the information across channels, then you would do this 1 cross 1 filters, n of them. Okay, so because you want to get the same dimension. So basically in the standard convolution filter, if you want to get n feature maps as output, you will define n filter kernels, each of size dk cross m, so that you get your output has n feature maps. Okay, so then if in this particular formulation where you do depth-based convolution filters, what you will do is since you know that there are m feature maps in your input, so you will define m filter kernels, but these are your standard size 3 cross 3. Let's say dk is 3, you get only 3 cross 3, And then when you operate on them, each of these M feature maps, you will get M output feature maps corresponding to each one of them. And of course, you will stack them all up and you do this so-called 1x1 convolution. So 1x1 convolution is basically the same operations as we saw with the 3x3, except that you just have a vector. That's all. So because it's of size 1 was 1 cross M, so you will operate that across the image, across the channels. But of course, you can define n such 1x1 filters and you get n outputs. Okay. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to operate, mix the information or take nonlinear combinations of the pixel voxel values in plane using these regular convolutions. And then across channels, you want to take nonlinear combination using these 1x1 convolutions. Okay, so don't get flustered by this 1x1 convolution because it's the same as 3x3, except that your filter size is one. That's it. You have a vector. So if you have m channels to work with, then your filter size is 1x1x m. Okay, the computations remain the same.